welcome our Green Themes presentation this evening. We have a colleague from East Lansing, Cathy DeShambo, East Lansing Environmental Services Administrator, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing how our counterparts down the road go about the business and see if we can find some ways to maybe collaborate in the future. So welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I think a few years ago you had one of our commissioners, our chair at the time, come out to your meeting, and she was extremely impressed and brought that back to our Commission on the Environment and what you were doing, and we kind of keep track of what you're doing over here as well. So I'm just taking a look at the slides here. There we go. So I am Cathy DeShambo. I am the Environmental Service Administrator for the City of East Lansing, and I wanted to give you this information up front because as we were talking before the meeting, it's an interesting arrangement that we have. I actually work out of the Department of Public Works, and I actually manage 3 divisions out of the Department of Public Works and about 25 union staff, about 10 seasonal staff. I am the staff liaison to the Commission on the Environment, and then I cover everything from urban forestry to wetland permitting with the Commission on the Environment, and a lot of other kinds of initiatives in between, and also doing a lot of grant writing, DEQ monitoring, all those kinds of things. But I thought it was important for you just to know that I handle sanitation recycling, the parks and downtown maintenance, which is a little different than Parks and Rec, and the garage and fleet for the city. So I do all the fleet purchasing, all the maintenance on fleet with our garage staff, and manage the garage and the mechanics as well. So I wanted to give you just a little bit of background in case you didn't know this. The Commission on the Environment in East Lansing is a 9-member commission made up of East Lansing residents. Currently our chair is Kieran O'Brien, who happens to be the executive director of the Michigan Recycling Coalition. Fantastic person who has been our chair for the last 2 years. Back when Sam Singh was the mayor of East Lansing, he signed on to the mayor's climate protection agreement, which is what got our climate sustainability plan started. It was actually formally established in 2012, and we consider it a living document. It has 5 focus areas: waste management, energy efficiency, renewable energy, transportation, and water management. And some of the recent accomplishments that we tie to the climate sustainability plan in each of those areas, I just wanted to share with you. So waste management, we have a very robust residential curbside recycling program. That 3 years, we made some major changes to that program 3 years ago, and almost tripled our volumes that we collect residentially in a month. We also have public space recycling now in the downtown in East Lansing. If you go into our downtown, you will see bright green recycling containers next to trash containers. They're very attractive, lovely. They're a parrot green. You can't miss them. And they are all over the downtown, and they are starting to be out in other areas as well now. In terms of, and we also just added a drop-off polystyrene number 6 station to our drop-off recycling station, which is probably one of the most popular things we've done as of late with our residents. They are absolutely thrilled about it, and our volume was so large that we actually had to get a second container because it's such a popular program. So we just kicked that off in March. Under energy efficiency, we're doing massive upgrades to our water resource recovery facility. One of the projects that is going to be underway shortly is an anaerobic digester that is going to save a tremendous amount of energy at that plant. Renewable energy, you may have heard of our community solar project at the Bircham Park, which is a former landfill. We're very excited to see that taking off. Transportation, we have a green fleet policy, and we have the first hybrid recycling truck in the state of Michigan that we purchased 3 years ago that we're very pleased with, and we've seen about a 40, sometimes 50% fuel reduction with that truck, that hybrid truck. Water management, we have very strong stormwater and pollution prevention programs that we implement in the city. So I just kind of wanted to give you some highlights of things that we're doing. Some of the things that we're currently tackling are, we have a sustainable building subcommittee that's updating our 2009 green building policy. We have a multifamily recycling subcommittee that's updating our ordinances for recycling. We also have a renewable energy subcommittee. So our Commission on the Environment right now is, while we meet once a month, we have subcommittees meeting nearly weekly at this point, doing lots of work on the outside. It's really important for us, and we felt like this was the fastest way to some resolutions in these areas and to getting the work done was to break off into these subcommittees and to really put some extra time outside of our normal meetings into these special focus areas. In some cases, the commissioners that are in these subcommittees have background in this particular area. In some cases, they don't. They're just very passionate about the area and willing to put in the work. Our Renewable Energy Subcommittee is probably our newest subcommittee, and they've met about 4 times now, but we've had meetings with both Consumers Energy and the Board of Water and Light that we were very pleased with and felt like we're making some really good progress there. The entire commission is working toward the integration of what I'm going to talk about a little bit more shortly is the resilience dialogues and how to integrate that into our climate sustainability plan as an update to our climate sustainability plan. Wanted to show you really quickly sustainability related topics addressed by commissions. I have this table to show you that we have a number of commissions in the city. And the Commission on the Environment is not necessarily the only commission that ever touches anything that we would consider environmental. We have planning, we have transportation, we have a Parks and Rec Commission, and we have a Historic Commission, so, and even our Housing Commission in some regards. So we have a table set up that kind of shows, you know, who's responsible for all these different areas that are actually codified in the city. So we thought that this was a really helpful tool so that at a glance, people could see, you know, if you're talking about habitat and landscape, urban forest, what commissions might touch that, what groups might touch that in the city and impact that area. I also wanted to mention something about public-private partnerships. This is something that we have found as a city has been working for us in the last few years. We've really found some success. When budget is tight, when time is tight, when staff are doing many things to try to move things forward, we found that these partnerships have actually helped us meet our goals and create things for our residents that they were looking for. So in the case of our new polystyrene number 6 recycling station, that was very much a partnership between a grant with the DEQ and a partnership with Dark Container. We couldn't have done that project and we would not be able to collect that material without those 2 key pieces. We use a lot of different partnerships throughout the city, but we really, even our public space recycling is the result of a multitude of partnerships that came together to help fund that project and help get us to that point, something we as a city could not have done on our own. So we are just very actively exploring all the ways that we can meet our goals and really expand what we're doing in the city with these kinds of partnerships. So I want to talk a little bit about something called the Resilience Dialogues. And there's an organization called ICLEI. It's really a Sustainable Cities worldwide organization. And through ICLEI, we had the opportunity to participate in the Resilience Dialogues last year. The Resilience Dialogues partners with communities and helps them to explore their risks from climate variability and to look at climate adaptation planning and resilience planning. So again, when we talk about partnerships and things that we would struggle to do on our own, this is a prime one. So while we're doing a climate sustainability plan and our commission is trying to do very good work, how do you bring that level of expertise to the table as a city, as a small community like East Lansing or Meridian Township, and actually find out what steps you need to take and get connected to the resources that you need to look at. So when we found this opportunity to be involved in the resilience dialogues, we thought that this was really something that we needed to pursue and needed to do. So they use a professionally facilitated online process where we can all meet, even though there were experts and scientists from California and all across the country. In an online platform, you can have dialogue and discussions that last for a week or 2 weeks, and out of that, get the resources that you need. So what they did is that they looked at East Lansing once we were chosen as a community. They looked at us and they said, let's get a really strong picture of what your community looks like. So we had several conference calls, we did some survey information. What are our priorities? What does our city look like? What are our concerns? What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? All of those kinds of things. Then they looked at the brainpower and expertise within their organizations that they had brought together to do these dialogues. So we had folks from, I mean, you can see this list of places where if we were to just contact these organizations and say, hey, do you have some folks that can help us? And can they do it for free? That would be great, right? We can't do that. So that's exactly what they did. So they matched us with really great people, and we pulled in some of our commissioners from the Commission on the Environment and other people within the community who were very interested, and we all participated in this dialogue. We were chosen among cities across the U.S. We were in the first non-piloted round of facilitated dialogues, and we had 2 weeks of facilitated discussions. We had 7 experts on our team, and we began to define our own resilience challenges. We explored economic, social, and environmental risks that we were looking at. We started to identify resources, and they helped us to do that. So really we had a week on of dialogue, and when we say dialogue, it meant that the facilitator and the participants were posing questions and then providing responses. It was a very rapid fire kind of scenario, as you can imagine, because people are jumping on at all different times of the day, and you're just trying to keep up, and conversations were happening very quickly. And so the facilitated dialogue would often cover several topics in a 24-hour period. So really we were charged with setting significant time aside in a 1-week period, a week or 2 weeks off for the experts to start really looking at what was said in those dialogues and what needs were expressed and what resources they could tie us to and what kinds of help they could offer us to really get to the core of what kind of planning we needed to do with this. And then we started another week on, and to start really looking at resources and discussing those resources and fine-tuning that. At the end of the process, we received a final report that really kind of brought all of those pieces together and gave us resources that we could take moving forward. That wasn't the end of it. We are still involved in that we have periodic updates and conference calls. We're connected to other communities. Savannah, Georgia is one that we've talked to before. You would think that maybe we don't have very much in common with a coastal community like that, but they struggle with urban forestry in some of the same ways that we do. So it was very interesting to talk with them about some of those risk factors and how to mitigate some of those risks, and to just have other communities out there who've had the same experience and are trying to struggle through the same kinds of planning. So I would love to say that I could just bring you lots of answers that came out of this resilience dialogue. For us, the most important thing so far is the number of questions that have been posed and how we plan moving forward in letting these questions guide our planning to updating our climate sustainability plan. We realized after we'd done the resilience dialogues that actually the information out of the resilience dialogues works perfectly to update our climate sustainability plan. That was sort of an unintended consequence that we weren't thinking about at the time. We thought this was a really great thing to be participating in, really good information to come out of it. I don't think that any of us thought that this would actually tie directly into our update to our climate sustainability plan, but it really seems to be working that way, and we're thrilled about that. And I'm not going to go through all of these questions, but I wanted you to have this information so that you could see sort of what we're looking at and what we're working with. But some of them, like, how do we embed resilience planning into policy planning? How do we do that? How do we think about that? What are effective methods for protecting resilience efforts from local, national, or global economic shocks? That question resonated with us at the time that we were doing these dialogues a year ago. Climate impacts on key infrastructures and systems. Certainly we think about these things and we think about infrastructure. Are we thinking about social systems too, though? And are we thinking about how significant these risks are or how likely they are to occur? Trees, other plants and wildlife, which species are most at risk from flooding? Some of these kinds of questions. Increases in temperature and rethinking acceptable tree planting. What are the impacts on our future planning in that regard? Encroachment of invasive species, dry conditions in gypsy moth. That's something that was in the forefront of some of our planning yet this year. And responding to the needs of vulnerable populations. As we talked through this actually became a very big piece of our dialogue that I don't think we anticipated ahead of time. So, what type of climate stressors tend to be unique to or amplified among low-income and vulnerable populations? And to really start thinking about that as the forefront of our planning, as opposed to the tail end, to really put that up in the front part of what we're doing. And thinking about it from being a university community and having students, and thinking about vulnerable populations in a variety of ways. Thinking about vulnerable populations in how we communicate and how we communicate to our residents who are not, English as a first language speakers. So what does that look like when we're trying to plan? And, what are the effective strategies for involving the full fabric of the community in building resilience for long-term success? These kind of questions allow us to take our climate sustainability plan and the focus areas of our climate sustainability plan and really take a much broader and deeper dive and much more connected dive to our community, I think. Social capital, civic engagement, and community identity. How do we protect things like our identity as a walkable and bikeable city? How can MSU and the city strengthen ties? Communication strategies for helping community members understand climate risk. And where can we collaborate, share, and engage in all those organizations, those partnerships that we've been trying to grow as a city? So, updating the climate sustainability plan based on the resources that were shared through the dialogue, and there were nearly 60 resilience planning resources shared during the dialogues. It's a lot of information. So we've actually spent the last 10 months or so taking those resources and really looking at them and trying to decide which are really things that we want to tackle first and which are really informative to our community. Prior to the resilience dialogues, we had just started to explore the option of collecting stormwater utility fees. This is something that got a little boost from this dialogue. That's something that was very encouraged. We want to increase coordination with relevant partners, explore new ways to partner and/or new partnerships. Want to consider creating a regional resilience committee. This really had some attention given to it during the dialogues. This was something, an idea, a concept that people really, really liked. We want to share the extensive resources from the dialogues. So what we're doing at this point is looking at putting together a web page on the city's site where people can go and we can share these resources and we can give updates as to what we're doing with these resources. And we want to collaborate in new ways with MSU, with other communities, possibly Meridian Township, and look at ways that we can do this regionally, because we're all quite small communities, and these are the kinds of big planning items that, you know, we might do better to do it as a regional community. Questions? I kind of flew through some of this because I didn't want to take a lot of your time, and I did not want to induce death by PowerPoint tonight, but I really wanted to give you some time to ask questions and find out what you're interested in.
Great, that's fantastic. Thank you. Questions from commissioners?
Yeah, I have, Cathy, thank you for the presentation. It was very helpful.
Thank you, John.
Could you give us some sense for the timetable related to the resilience activities? You know, when you might update your sustainability plan, you know, how long that might take, but also, you know, I'm glad to see the idea of the collaboration with our township. That'd be marvelous, or a regional committee might even be better. So that's something, I don't know if you have any specific ideas how we might start that process, but that would be helpful too.
Sure. So time frame, so we really don't want to let the time get away from us on this one. You know, it's taken, since we only meet once a month and we do have other things on our agendas, we've had this on the agenda 4, 5, 6 times since we've had the resilience dialogue. So we've had work sessions and we've had planning towards it. The update to the climate sustainability plan, I think, is something that we want to accomplish in the next 6 months. That may be aggressive. It's there's a lot to it. There's a lot. I'm sure you all know that as well. And so that may be a little aggressive, but we're really hoping to get some traction on this. And partnerships would be very much a part of that. Yes.
Quick question.
Yes.
So you were talking about collecting the stormwater. So how would that work?
Stormwater fees.
Yeah.
So, you know, there are different communities that have tried this. Ann Arbor is one that I saw a presentation on recently. And so there may be a fee that can be collected from residents or from businesses for that collection of stormwater based on, you know, that sliding kind of scale of volume. There are ways to also reduce those fees for people doing certain activities. Rain barrels, different kinds of green infrastructure on their property that could possibly reduce those fees as well. So definitely something that we're looking at.
Well, the dialogues is a fascinating approach. I feel like we've been sort of doing that in a much less organized fashion. So when we have the state climatologist come and present his view of how the climate of Michigan has changed and is likely to change in the future, then we sort of start picking his brain about individual thoughts that come from that perspective. We have the Drain Commissioner's office represented here. We're kind of picking their minds, but it's not nearly as organized as the approach that you've described. I mean, I can see that being very helpful both for revising a sustainability plan, but also for really moving towards implementation and picking out the sort of low-hanging fruit of things that we can actually get to work on. One thing that occurred to me when you were talking about vulnerable populations, the township was called on last year under an ice storm when a lot of people lost power in the middle of the winter and had to rally and really did a heroic job, the manager and staff, to create and run a warming center. And you could imagine in a dialogue like this, considering that that may not be a one-off, that may be something that happens, but knowing ahead of time how many people might be affected and having the procedures in place to notify people could make that much more responsive and resilient. So that's a great approach. I also had a question about, you mentioned public-private partnerships and gave the example of public space recycling. And I was curious what the private role there is. I assume it was in the purchase or the installation of some of the receptacles and things.
Right. There were a couple private roles, actually. So the first part of that project actually came out of a grant that we received for our curbside recycling program. That came from the Recycling Partnership, which is a national organization that brings many groups together who want to fund better recycling in communities. We were actually one of the first communities out of the South, the first one in Michigan to receive one of their grants. They've gotten a lot more attention in the last couple of years. They've really grown and been able to expand their programs, but they're funded by a variety of companies and organizations that all have a goal to increase recycling in communities, to really move that bar up and move those volumes up, because they have clients or products that need that stock feed and need that material often. So there's a synergistic relationship there. So we received this grant to transform our curbside recycling program. One of the companies that had contributed to this grant was Amcor, plastics company, and they have a pretty large presence in Michigan. And they reached out to us on their own and said, we have some sustainability money, and we really like your community. We like what we see. We give internships to MSU students every year. They have some connection to MSU, and we really would like to do an additional project. And they said, we want it to be public space recycling, and we want to help you with some seed money for that. Public space recycling is pretty expensive. It's a pretty expensive endeavor. And we did not want to do this in a patchwork way. We really wanted it to take off and be very comprehensive throughout the downtown. So we looked at what are the ways we can grow that funding. So we looked at other departments within the city, collected some funds from parking and from planning and various other groups, our DDA, and then we went to the public spaces, private places, I hope I'm getting that right now without having it in front of me, grant opportunity, which is really like a crowdfunding program. And we said, we've got this amount of seed money, how can we grow this with a project? So we ended up just adding that project on. We also put in some bicycle hoops in the downtown because we recognized that as an extra need and that it would make our project actually more interesting to folks. And so we did the crowdfunding through Patronicity, and we made our goals. And so we saw that money grow to the point where we could do the initial set. We had enough to keep us going for a second phase. And in that second phase, we looked at some other funding opportunities too. Amcor was so happy with what we were able to do with their small seed money, and it wasn't small, I don't mean to diminish it, but it was in comparison to what the whole project cost. It was a small amount of money, but they were so happy with how we grew that money that they came back about 6 months later with additional funding for us as well for a second phase. So sometimes it's just putting together those relationships and those opportunities that arise and looking for ways to keep them going and keep them to the point where you can complete an entire project, and looking for other partners that want to jump in and help you out.
I'm curious if there have been, or if you've thought about opportunities to include that kind of infrastructure as possible public amenities in development proposals that might help an applicant qualify for waivers from some density or other restrictions.
We actually, so the design of those containers is mandated now in our development downtown, so that when we've had some development now that's recently finished, they actually had to install those exact same containers as part of their project.
And
So-
those are accessible to the public, not just the
Yes.
residents or users of
Yes.
those businesses.
Yes.
So that is a requirement in the ordinance in the same way that parking or other aspects of a plan are requirements of?
It's part of their site plan approval, so it's part of, as they're being approved, you have this much public space, you're gonna need to install these, and this is the design standard that has to be met.
Mhm. Are there other environmental related amenities like that are part of the downtown process? I mean, you mentioned the bike parking, and I've seen the innovative sculptures and
Right.
things.
Right, our funding for art, public art, is certainly one that is codified, that is an ordinance, and it's mandated. Bike parking is something that is definitely part of our process of approval. Our stormwater, the ways that you can meet the stormwater credits that you need to meet for development in our city has a lot of green infrastructure built into it to try to encourage that. So when we're looking at our updating our sustainable building policy, our green building policy from 2009, the approach that we're taking right now is that we really want to look at an incentive-based program. And we're looking at what are those incentives. You know, we're already encouraging mixed-use properties. That's been something that the city's been encouraging, and we have incentives tied to that, especially for housing for 55 and older that's integrated into housing in the downtown. We really want to look at also some sustainable building practices that developers may not necessarily be doing all the time or not really considering, but with an incentive would consider doing. Green roofs are already incentivized to some degree through our stormwater program. So that there may be opportunity to even strengthen that a little further, but there may be some other areas that we can get LEED standards that are very sustainable tied to a particular kind of possibly quicker permitting or some other incentive that a developer is looking for.
Sure. I know one of the last applications that came to the Planning Commission here surprised me a little bit in that the applicant, who the project is a new car dealership, was mentioning that many of their facilities, they own multiple dealerships in the region, that many of their facilities are LEED certified. And that kind of caught me a little bit by surprise, a pleasant surprise. So one thing that we've talked about as a commission a little bit, and I don't think we've gotten very far on it, is our traditional approach is to wait until an applicant purchases a property, begins a permitting process, presents a plan, and then try to get them to be as green as possible, right? Which always feels like you're chipping away at the profit margin of the project that they had in mind when they purchased the property. And trying to think if there are ways that we can be a bit more proactive at try to bring people to the community, attract people to the community who are already thinking along those lines, so that we're not kind of coming after chasing the 8-ball. And we did have a presentation, a Green Themes presentation recently from Brett Forsberg, local developer, who feels like, I think his group is Urban Systems. Is that seems like that's kind of their business model, is to be the leader in that kind of area. And it would be interesting if there were a way for communities to share knowledge and experience of other builders who have that perspective, and work more proactively with them to encourage them to think about doing projects locally. I don't know if you've come across that or you have ideas in that regard.
Well, I can tell you a couple of the things that we've done with that subcommittee, because we have that exact same feeling on our commission, is that a project comes in, so much of it is already realized to the point where if you say, well, what about this, or we'd really like to see this, you know, you're almost an impediment to the project completing, where if it were done up front, or if it were somehow telegraphed that these are the expectations for our community and we want you to come in meeting those expectations already, that's what we're looking for. So we had a lot of discussion about this, and we talked about possibly really promoting the idea of levels that buildings have achieved. So really promoting any buildings that are LEED certified in our communities, and really promoting the things that they do, and saying, you know, if you meet these standards that are sustainable, if you do these things with your buildings, we're going to make sure that people know about it. We're going to do our part to celebrate that. Another thing we did is we talked to a local developer, one who is currently developing a very large project in our downtown. And he met with our subcommittee and our planning department. And it was really to pick his brain about, as a developer, as we look to update this policy, what would incentivize you and what would inspire you to do these things, and to really start from the beginning doing these things, rather than us saying, we're looking at your plans and we want to see more of this, to really get them interested. That was a very good conversation, an interesting conversation. We also engaged with a professor at MSU who works with LEED standards all the time and is an expert in that area, and talked to him about, you know, is it reasonable to say, okay, well then everybody has to meet that standard. If this is what we want, let's just do it. Let's say, is that reasonable? So we've kind of gone and explored all of these routes. I would say right now we're somewhere in we want to incentivize, and we want really strong pieces of LEED in projects, and we want that to happen really early on and up front. And so that's where it's kind of leveling out.
It feels to me like most of the time we have the conversation about LEED certification, the answer is we're happy to build, and even I hear this at MSU, our goal is to build to a LEED certifiable standard, but we don't see that the investment in doing the certification is worthwhile. And I take it that the issue is that the process of becoming certified to give the certification on a particular project is expensive. And that not every applicant is going, or builder is going to have someone on staff who can do that. And I wonder if that might be an area for more regional cooperation, if there were somebody who had that ability to do that certification, who could somehow provide that more cost effectively.
That's the exact conversation that we've had as well, and we've heard that as well. Yes.
Gotcha. Go ahead.
Resiliency is an interesting word, interesting concept. I presume some people have heard it a long time ago. I heard it about maybe 10, 12 years ago when somebody came and talked to a national commission that I was on, and they're talking about resiliency, and it was just going right over our head. What are you talking about? Have you had, what we heard it mostly was resiliency as related to the New Orleans hurricane, and how to somehow capture whatever resiliency is and have that community brought back. And I guess in Milwaukee, I'm not quite sure what the occasion was, but they talk about resiliency. Did you have any interaction with some of those? I hear yours concentrating pretty much on climate resiliency. And there we weren't, neither of those I thought were talking about climate, resiliency factors. I just wondered, did you hear from those, and what kind of feelings do you get?
So I actually had a slide with the definition that we were kind of using through the course of the resiliency dialogues that I took out when I was trying not to give you too many of those. And
we already knew it. Huh?
I did. So, but I think that this is a really interesting point because we really looked at, so I agree, when the terminology was first used, let's say way back, let's look at a decade ago, I often heard it used in connection with hardening structures, right? Hardening or making infrastructures sounder, stronger, all of those kinds of things. But it wasn't necessarily tied to adaptive strategies so much. And another piece of it that I think is really important, thank you very much, is the idea that what you were talking about with the warming centers and the vulnerable populations and what resiliency means in those crisis situations, right? So we're looking long term and we're looking what can we do in the projects that we're doing within the city, in the planning that we're doing, in ordinances that we pass, in policy that we make. What are we looking forward to say as climate changes, as we know it is, what can we do to mitigate and adapt and be resilient to what is going to happen down the road, and even right now, currently what's happening? I think another piece of this, when we're talking about these vulnerable populations and what happens in a crisis situation, one of the things that we've done in the city that was really unrelated to the resilience dialogues or the Commission on the Environment, but in my mind became very related, is that we've required city staff to take FEMA training. And so some of us have to take very high-level FEMA training to be ready for situations that could occur in our communities. And so for such a small community, I think at this point there are 8 or 9 of us that have actually gone to the level of going down to College Station, Texas for a week for the really intense training that happens down there. And having done the resilience dialogues just prior to the training that I took down there, I realized it's all connected, it's all related. So whether it be how we respond and how we're prepared for things like a massive ice storm, which we all experienced how many years ago, and would maybe be better prepared if that were to happen now in the next year, 2 years, or 3 years. But how we also plan for what our city's infrastructure looks like and how it can handle the changes that are coming. What does urban forestry look like in the coming years, and how do we plan for that? How do we look at what we're doing with urban forestry to help mitigate and adapt to those climate changes? So I think that, and I've rambled a little bit, and I apologize, I worked the election last night. And I think I'm hitting my, because it was a very late evening, let's just say that. It was very worthwhile, but very late evening, and so if I'm rambling, you just have to cut me off. But I think that, I think that it's all connected in those ways, right? And I think that we're finding that that resilience definition has got to grow and expand with what we know. And I felt that in the dialogues, and I think that what you're doing with bringing speakers in, doing that over time, is really very, very similar to what we did. We just did the very crash course speed dating version of it, and and now have to kind of catch up with all the information that we have. But I think that it's exactly the right thing to do, because we really have to have that information that touches all parts of our community, right? That's the only way that we're going to be able to adapt and change for it.
Absolutely. Great. If there's nothing else, I'd like to thank, oh, Leroy, go ahead.
You showed that little matrix,
Mhm.
different departments and missions.
Mm-hmm.
Did you come up with that, or how did you come up with that?
We pulled it together. That actually came out of some work that we were looking at our Transportation Commission and our Commission on the Environment, and looking at some overlap that we had, and in trying to kind of tease out things that really should work with transportation, and things that we were doing together. And we'd had some joint planning and working with our council liaisons, and kind of pulled this information together.
Okay, thanks.
Super. Well, thank you again for coming.
Thank you very much. Thank you.